Is mindfulness in schools just about meditation for kids? Hardly. Come on, let's find out more. Hello, and welcome to Mindfulness Voyage. My name is Ted Meissner. Glad you could join us. If you are new to this podcast, so glad you could be here with us for the first time. And for those of you who are returning, thank you so much for your subscribing and liking and helping this podcast grow organically. I really appreciate that. Now, our topic of mindfulness in schools and mindfulness in general for kids is one that's going to, one we keep returning to again and again over the years. Hopefully, this podcast will be lasting. But it's more than just mindfulness for the kids. That's something that's out there in the world. Later today, I'm going to be recording a guided meditation for a younger audience. It's everywhere. But it's not just the kids. It's also parents. Parents who are juggling their own stressors, their own difficulties, their own lives while trying to provide for the best life for their children. Today's guest has some experience in that. So come on, let's go meet Daniel. Our guest today is Daniel Rechtschaffen. Daniel, thank you so much for being here. It's good to see you again. It's been a while.
It has been a while. Very happy to be here.
I noticed, because we've been in touch and I get emails from you, that you did a talk recently about parenting in troubled times. And before we kind of dive into that general topic, not just that specific talk, but the topic in general, because this is something you've been working on for years, I wonder if you might say a little bit about your work of mindfulness for kids, because I know a lot of the people who are viewers here might not have listened to the previous episode or have an idea about your background.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I come from a background, early in my background, I was privileged to actually grow up and learn mindfulness when I was pretty young. I grew up a lot at the Omega Institute, which is a holistic learning center where, meditation and yoga and places like that, back when it was still a weird fringe thing, and now not the mindfulness that we know now that's been woven into every fabric of our culture. And so I was raised there, getting to, walk into the rooms where yoga was being done, and John Kabat-Zinn was like a kind of uncle figure of mine. And so I actually really appreciate that my parents never made me practice meditation or made me do yoga or anything like that, but I kind of absorbed it. And so for me, as I went to public school, I had a regular life simultaneously. And as I went through my teen insecurities and my anxiety, I had a lot of anxiety as a kid. Those practices I learned as a kid were accessible to me, and I was able to go and talk to people, and my parents were deep, meditation practitioners. And so for me, it was mindfulness from when I was very young was very important to me, both just working with my own regulation, but also on the deeper spiritual side of it. I was always a bit of a seeker of deeper truth. Your question was about how I, do this with kids, but the longer arc there is that as I became went to psychology school and moved out to the Bay Area and started working as a school therapist, I saw all of the same issues that I had with as a kid, or worse, because I was working in some very difficult schools, and really seeing kids struggling with anxiety and anger issues and attentional issues. And I was like, I wonder, I was just siloed in my little office. Like, I wonder if this will work for other kids. And was having some, really wonderful experiences of working with mindfulness with my therapy, young therapy clients, mostly middle school clients. And at the same time, a guy named Richard Shankman and a woman named Lori Grossman started what became Mindful Schools. And I just heard about it on my radar as something that was happening. And I was like, I would get this total light bulb of get me in there. So I was one of the first teachers in this new organization that really had not been, I mean, of course, some cultures have been teaching meditation to kids for thousands of years, but here in America, the idea of, really bringing in a more science-based mindfulness approach, I got the privilege of being on the kind of first wave of going into schools throughout Oakland, mostly public schools throughout Oakland, and trying all these practices and having these other great mindfulness teachers who were doing it, and having really amazing results, and falling on our faces and being like, well, that didn't work, and this class was just basically running around circles around me the whole time. How do we make this more engaging? How do we make this fun? And that journey really took me both teaching kids, but I think I've spent most of my career actually working with teachers and working with school systems, working with burnout, working with creating kind of an atmosphere, a mindful atmosphere, kind of creating more relaxation and emotional trust and things like that for school systems. At the moment, I work with a school called the Millennium School in San Francisco, which is a middle school, and I'm their mindfulness director, and we also have kind of a partnership with San Francisco Unified School District where I'm piloting a middle school mindfulness program in the San Francisco schools. So it's a private school, but we're really have this kind of lab school vision of being able to play with all these very interesting mindfulness, emotional intelligence practices, and then trying to bring them to the larger community. So yeah, that's my day job.
And it's fascinating because you have been in this field for so long. And as you mentioned, one of the starters of mindful schools, one of those first teachers there, doing this kind of work and bringing mindfulness into school systems. And you've been working with parents that whole time and teachers that whole time. And I want to bring us back to this particular talk, Parenting in Troubled Times. How did this one come about? What is something that made you want to give this particular talk and with this particular audience?
Yeah. Well, I've become rather obsessed with the idea of crisis, even apocalypse. It's an interesting mindful apocalypse exploration. I've I kind of I had an interesting process where, I was doing this work, teaching in schools. That led me to, I wrote a couple books on the topic. So I was traveling around the world. Like my career was such that I was, flying all over the place and teaching. And as I was doing it, I started having the same experience that most of the teachers I worked with I was getting burned out. I was getting kind of like losing the thread of the initial light bulb impulse. And for a bunch of years, I just kind of kept trying to figure out how to make it to reconnect myself. But I was really needing to listen. Like there's some way that I was a little burned out. I was a bit not really in my calling anymore. And I decided to do a sabbatical and took a year. I took 6 months off, which happened to align with my son being born. My wife called it my sadatical rather than my sabbatical. My wife and I had been trying to get pregnant for 6 years, a lot of struggle there. And it just so happened all to align perfectly, and also aligned perfectly with the pandemic and with, insane forest fires that are right outside of, up the hill from where I'm sitting right now. And I think everyone listening, knows the apocalyptic nature, the crisis nature of wherever you live. There's the different droughts and fires and floods and pandemics, all the horses of apocalypse. And so I was on a sabbatical during the pandemic, crazy toxic smoke all around our home with an infant in my arms, a very colicky infant in my arms. So I feel like I was in this experience of, I had a deep meditation where I was really clear that I didn't want to work. I didn't even want to write anything. I just wanted to be in like a fallow year where everything was just kind of stopped, and from that, I got started getting really deeply fascinated in the concept of collapse and crisis and the actual kind of generative aspect of that. I really started studying very deeply both kind of ancient mythologies, religions around, the human relationship throughout time to collapse, to things ending, to death, and then really interested in, climate change science and all types of science around cycles, adaptive cycles, how things grow and how things fall and how things stay healthy. And I went a bit mad scientist, in the best possible way of, and for me, it actually does fit deeply with mindfulness and with the more spiritual core of my life. And so again, a long way of saying, as I've re-engaged with work, I'm really interested in, how we parent, how we raise our children, how I work in schools with an understanding of, um, both how to support ourselves and our kids through struggling times, through changing times. Um, but also, I feel what I really have been meditating on is that so much of our culture is around this kind of perpetual growth and this kind of upward philosophy of going, escaping the bad earth and going up to heaven and trying to do all of it rather than coming back to these more generative mythologies of how everything dies and is reborn, how we are a part of these kind of natural cycles. And so the teaching that I was doing there is really trying to help. I've gotten very into also the idea of, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, of how both individually and collectively we kind of run on this sympathetic fight, flight, freeze energy, and what it takes to be able to come back to this parasympathetic, relaxed state and be in these cycles, for parents where they're able to not be stressing their kids out and being anxious about the end of the world, and how paradoxically to support our kids with the crises that are in our world, a big piece of it is relaxing and coming back to a kind of clear discernment. Um, and Yeah, it's a massive discussion, but happy to jump into it with you.
Well, it is. That's part of what I wanted to get at is as you were speaking, there's this arising of awareness that it's parents who are struggling right now with
Mm.
everything you've just mentioned. And there's also the dimension of their parents and they need to talk with their kids about this and
Yeah.
help their kids with it too. And I was wondering what that was like as you're crafting in for this talk and for your work in general, this holding of the very wide space of the parents are struggling too. And this is learning and practice for them as well as then adding in the complexity for their kids. What's that been like?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different layers to it. One thing I was saying in the talk is that there's a bereavement specialist who I was listening to, who was saying how, somebody who worked with thousands of children whose parents or loved ones had passed. And what she said was that the one thing she never heard from the kids was that their parents told them too much, right? Or their caregivers told them too much. It was always that they didn't tell them enough, right? So like the kids know this, they're living in the atmosphere of it, and then there's a kind of an aloneness and a confusion if they're not being told what's actually the reality. And I think that oftentimes we don't talk to kids about painful things because of our own fear of the emotions it will elicit, right? And my son's only 4, but I've gotten to have a bunch of experiences of this when, like, we've got chickens and one, his favorite chicken, gets eaten by bobcat or something, and and we need to break the news to him, and I can feel the impulse to somehow make up a story that the chicken got out and is living in some happy pasture somewhere. But when I actually tell him the experience, I tell him what's happening, and he actually is way more resilient than I am, right? He hears it, he cries a little bit, I hold him, and he's like, "Where did the bobcat go? Let's go see if we can find any feathers from the chicken." He rolls with it so easily. And there's a way that resilience in children to be able to understand and meet the experience, like more so than teaching them what to actually do around climate change or AI or anything like that. Because the truth is, we don't really know very well, right? Like we know bits. The main, 95% of what we want to be teaching them is how to be able to be regulated enough to be able to experience the emotions, experience the fear. Like a lot of the neuroscience pieces around how when we're in the fight, flight, freeze state, our capacity for discernment and nuance gets shut down, right? And what do we need most in a moment of crisis or in a moment of polarized things in the world is we need to be able to empathize, which gets shut down when we're in fight and flight. And so that, for me, that was a huge one just personally of I really noticed in the pandemic and in other moments, like my discernment, I could tell was pretty off. Like I was more anxious at moments. I was like, I want to be able to have good discernment because, of course, sometimes fight, flight, and freeze are necessary. We do need to fight at moments. I do, if the fire is coming up my hill, I need to get everything in the car and go, right? So, like, we need those, but most of the time we don't, right? Most of the time we need to find that steadiness where we're able to discern what's happening and empathize with others. And so yeah, that, a lot of what I'm was teaching the teachers and continue or the parents is how do we catch the ways that we are polarizing? Because most of us are, and we all are in certain ways, right? Politically, in our communities, and we're tightening into our own camp, and then and how much are we over anxious about a situation, and how do how do we come back to a level of discernment about that situation? Because most of what we teach our kids is that polarization and that anxiousness, or we teach them how to notice a very nuanced, painful reality, right? There is, all of these, ecological degradation. There is, really heartbreaking things in American culture, and how do we open to the heartbreak of it and the nuance of it and teach our kids to feel all of it, and then to be able to have the discernment to meet it in a way that we don't have the answers because the issues are moving so quickly that we actually need to just teach them to be able to have good discernment and capacity.
You mentioned the encounter with difficulties, that there's this fight, flight, or freeze, that's not a bad thing. We need that to survive often. And I'm curious how receptive the parents are to this idea that mindfulness is not just about calming down and chilling and finding a bliss point, but it's also turning towards these kind of difficult things to turn towards. How receptive are they when you give talks like this?
Do you have some of that experience too?
Oh, yeah. Yes, quite a lot.
Well, I mean, I think there's a mixture in my experience. Sometimes I think that it's a really actually deep relief for people to not think that, people get into mindfulness and they assume, or a lot of them assume, that mindfulness means being totally calm and thoughtless and happy. And then they try to practice, and pretty quickly they realize, like, I'm actually
Like that.
anxious and my thoughts are all over the place. I must be doing this wrong. Right. So on some level, it's actually really helpful to be saying, hey, what we're doing is being able to be present with the chaos inside and with the anger, and not trying to shut the anger down and not trying to shut the grief down. It's actually, how do we welcome this and learn from it? And um, so actually, on some level, I think that's actually really been helpful for people, and helpful for people, especially parents, right? Like the experience of being a parent is really hard a lot of the times. Just on the basic level of not having the time to sit and meditate, or not having the time to just sit, right? Like we're just very stretched. And so being able to be in a kind of teaching and exploration around, even if it's just the chaos, not the chaos and crisis of the outer world, but just the chaos and crisis of having some kids, and, ever moving, changing, um, and how do we meet that, not in some, perfect meditative, I'm always going to be graceful in this, but how do I stay as compassionate to myself and others as possible in the midst of all of this?
Yeah, it's just today in teaching classes and sharing this idea that, hey, we're going to turn towards experience, and it may be difficult and it may be joyous. It may be a lot of different things that's expected. Most people there are recognizing that actually feels kind of nice. I'm not alone in
Mhm.
encountering difficulties with it. So it sounds like that once that awareness is there, and especially that others are finding it too,
Yeah,
really
it's an
helpful
amazing
conditioning.
that particular piece of turning toward experience. Like, I often use the metaphor of turning the ship of your awareness into the storm of your experience. And I've found, like, I used to lead these 5-day mindfulness and education retreats for educators, and I would teach so many different things and all this different stuff, and invariably the main insight that everybody had was that, and they would come up and say, I never knew to actually orient into the experience, especially the uncomfortable experience, right? How to, rather than trying to get rid of the anxiety or get rid of the swirling thoughts, or, to actually stay lovingly present with them. I think that is at least the first um, great doorway of mindfulness, right? And on some level, it's the first and the last. Like, on some level, that's all. If you learn to fully embrace and open to existence as it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's huge.
Let's shift gears just a little bit and looking more widely at some changes that you might like to see in the coming years, maybe things that we don't have now, whether it's resources or attitudes or other kinds of shifts that might help parents in dealing with their own stressors as well as helping their kids with them.
Um, it's a good question. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that one of the first places is just what we're saying here. One of the things that we do at the Millennium School is we have something called forums, and the forums are just a basic community group that meets together every couple of weeks and practices some mindfulness, talks about what's going on in our lives. If one person has an issue, they'll talk about it. Everyone will kind of circle them. And we do this with all of our parents. We have these forum, all of our staff does this, all of our kids have a forum, um, all of our parents are in a forum, and we do this for a lot of other schools and communities where we create these forums for them. And um, I bring that up because that if every parent had a circle of caring support and a kind of framework where they could come together regularly and just talk about what's going on and sit together. And I do think that things like that. There's a deep fragmentation in my experience in parenting where we're doing it alone. We're doing it in isolation, and we don't have a lot of us don't have the kind of family grandparent structure to kind of be there. We don't have structures, community structures where we're kind of just in a continual support. And I think that for the parents and for the kids, it's an isolating experience, and it's a stressful experience. I read a piece of research about how um, they do a kind of happiness or kind of well-being index, and the well-being index before people have kids, and then when they have them, and then after the kids leave. And in America, the happiness index, is high or whatever it is, and then they have kids and it dips, and then it goes low, and then once the kids leave, then it goes back up. But in a lot of cultures that they've found where they've done the exact same index, in some, Northern European, in some, I think like Sweden, Finland, and then in some Asian cultures where there's a whole lot more both family systems intact, but also a lot of government resource, that's not the case. That it doesn't dip. That the happiness actually stays or even goes higher when kids happen, because that I think that for those that have a certain level of support, and I don't imagine, once every other week getting to have a council is going to, or a forum is going to solve that issue, but that is the direction that that I would most hope for parents, is being able to have community, to be like, for me, even though I teach this stuff and I've got friends and family, there's a deep isolation about, a specific issue that comes up about my son, throwing so many tantrums. And I'm like, oh my God, is this normal? Like, should he be throwing this? Like, and then it takes usually just like one friend for me to talk to. And they're like, yeah, totally. He's 4. That's just what happens.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Like there's a way that having that kind of culture around you to normalize and to so yeah, I mean, on that level, both for parents and for students, this has also been my experience teaching mindfulness to kids, which is that, uh, and to parents, like going in and doing a professional development for parents, or going into a classroom and leading a mindfulness lesson, that is great. We should do that. I am doing that. But to be able to create culture, right? To support culture. I don't think you can create culture, but to support and nurture, the organic experience of culture arising, um, and to have my kind of mindfulness and different types of rituals involved in there. That's what I'm wanting to be up to, is supporting more intact cultures.
Yeah, it brings in that dimension that I see a shift these days from meditation being a something done in solitude as a personal introspection to being more social, that it is a
Mhm.
team sport and it connects in all areas of our lives.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask, you have a couple of books. I'm wondering if you might share a little bit about those, and then one final question for you.
My books. Well, I've got the first 2 books I wrote were The Way of Mindful Education, and then the Mindful Education Workbook, which are really manuals for educators, both to practice their own mindfulness and then to bring it into students. The workbook I recommend. I recommend them both, but the workbook I feel like is a really wonderful tool for individuals and for schools to be able to kind of really know how to bring the different capacities of mindfulness. And then I've written a couple kids books, called Alpha Breaths and Alpha Breaths 2 with my friend Chris Willard. which are very sweet, fun breathing books for kids. And I'm working now on a book more around crisis and how do we are in relationship to crisis. I've been working on it for years and might work on it for several more years. But yeah, that's really a deep place that my heart and mind are around how we can support young people, just also support all of us to be in deeper discernment. And what I've really been getting into with it is how much the way we respond to threat is even more important than the threat itself. We often even kind of create issues by being so freaked out by them, even if they don't exist or if they just exist a little. And the way that we're able to meet crisis, the way we're able to come together and stay in our empathy and our mindfulness, and that's so deeply what we need right now. So that's a lot of what my kind of thinking and writing is going into at this moment.
For those who might be watching this, if there's a parent, say, who's having a hard time just with the crisis that are happening around them and maybe with their own kids, if you could say just one thing that might be an encouragement or an insight for them, what might that be?
Um, yeah, I mean, immediately when you said it, I flashed on, different really hard things that parents with kids might be struggling with, right? Because there's so much more anxiety and suicidality and, deep, just very painful things that might come up. So there's no platitude that I want to offer in a specific kind of like just be compassionate to yourself. But what I actually do, what's been really profound for me in this exploration I've been doing around crisis is that the more I've actually focused on crisis and looking the history of crises and looking at climate change science and looking at all of the different kind of existential threats and really meditating deeply on my own death and the impermanence of everything, I've actually gotten way more relaxed about all of it. Feel way more at ease. And that's been the kind of essential truth of so many mystics throughout the ages. Meditating in graveyards is like really just being present with the truth of our impermanence and our death. And once again, what you said, orienting into the experience, right? Okay, yes, this is so painful. This is so heartbreaking. How do I breathe the pain fully in, the grief fully in, the love fully in, and open to it? And it's hard. There's moments where pain and grief and situations are so much that, it's kind of out of range to be able to fully open to it. But that is the practice. That is the deepest level mindfulness practice, is opening even to that.
Those who might be interested in finding out more about you and your work, where should they go?
Where should they go? They should go to the website I need to update. They can go to danielrekshoffen.com, and also mindfuleducation.com.
Great. And I will be linking those on the place where links exist for this kind of stuff. Daniel, thank you so much for being here. Really good to see you again. And thank you for your work.
Thank you, Ted. Great to be here too.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you got something out of today's episode, especially some of the links that are going to be on the webpage where links are found for this. And remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time.